What's that? Something went wrong. What's that?
It says you're live.
Yes. Greetings, 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 and welcome to another episode of Women and Resistance. And tonight we're talking about Sister Gwendolyn Brooks, poet, a black woman, as she would like to be described. But before we delve into who she is, I would introduce my sister from another mother, Sister Aya Fubara Eneli Esquire. How are you, sister?
Good evening. Pleasure to be here again.
Yes, the pleasure is all mine. And yes, we're looking at the lives and times of Gwendolyn Brooks, poet extraordinaire. And she would rather like to be described as an ordinary black woman. I wonder why. But
I
do
switched
you,
from YouTube TV to Philo, and it's saving me six.
so who is Gwendolyn Brooks?
What would be the best way to answer that question? It's weird for someone to ask you who you are. Of course, I've lived with myself my whole life. I suppose that the answer to that question varies depending on the lens through which you're looking at me. So, as a writer, who am I to my daughter, to my son? Who am I to my husband? Who am I to the Pulitzer Prize committee? Who am I to the men and women in my writers' workshops? Who am I to the young children that I love to teach? Who am I to the to our brothers and sisters who are locked behind bars,
Hmm.
because I love to go to the prisons and teach. Who am I? I am many things. Um, what I do hope all of those different groups, those I've mentioned and those I haven't mentioned, will agree on. But yeah, even then, I don't think they will agree because I don't think that it is quite possible for white people to really understand us as
Hmm.
black people and with our lived experiences. So I think that their response will be different. But at the core of all of that, I am a person who loves my community deeply. I'm a writer, I'm a poet. I started writing, as my mother says, as young as 6. I had a collection of poetry, and some days I write a poem, some days two, some days more. That's what I do every day. um I love words, and I love to write.
Hmm. So critics will often, critics unanimously agree that your works were specifically written for black people. Would you consider that a fair assessment of your work?
Well, depends on which critics you were talking to, because the book that actually won the Pulitzer,
Mm-hmm.
um, people complained that it was written not for Black people. It was very, which in, even that criticism in it has some undertones of racism, in the
Racism.
sense that, the idea was that it was a very technical book, that I really focused on technique in terms of the outlining of the poetry, the poems in that book. And so the idea was that it had not been written for a Black audience. However, and that would be Annie Allen,
Yeah.
that won the Pulitzer Prize in 1950, when I was 32 years old. Yes. Um, but What's interesting about that is there are a subset, a strata, if you will, of Negroes, and I use that word intentionally. Black elites, I guess, would be a more contemporary term, who would not read anything by a black person until it got the stamp of approval of white people. And so I
Hmm.
suppose that in becoming the first person of African descent to win a Pulitzer Prize for poetry, that 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 brought about a certain ascension, if you will, a certain improvement in my stature. Funny story, depending on if you have a sense of humor or not. When I got the call that I had won the Pulitzer Prize, I was in our little apartment and the lights were out. It was about dusk. When I mean the lights were out, I don't mean that we had not turned the lights on. I mean we were behind on our electricity bill. And so we had no lights, literally. And so by the next morning, when reporters and people started to show up and wanted to interview me and wanted to come into the home and everything, I didn't know quite how that was going to work, but somebody paid the light bill. I still have no idea who.
Hmm.
Um, but such was our existence. That we were regular people pursuing a passion. Wasn't about making money, but it was a passion. I was compelled to write. I've always been compelled to write, even before I knew that it could be a profession or a career. People say, "Was that your ambition?" I don't know what you're talking about. No, I just
Hmm.
had. I was compelled to write, and I have to thank both my parents because they played an extraordinary role
Hmm.
in um in carving a childhood and in encouraging that in me,
Hmm.
in cultivating that, in nourishing it, in creating an environment where, what my mother always used to say to me, and I'm going to tell you about my parents. My mother, um, mm, my mother was Keziah Wims Brooks. Keziah Wims Brooks. And my mother, when I was yet a little girl, would say to me, "You would be the Lady Paul Lawrence Dunbar."
Hmm.
And if you don't know that name, then don't just research and learn about me, which the best way really to learn about me is to sit with my work. And I have so much of it out there.
Yep.
But I still have my collection of Paul Laurence Dunbar poems that was given to me as a child. And I suppose that she meant well. And of course, that was something that evoked a certain sense in me. But of course, as an older woman, a more mature person at this point, the goal for any artist is not to be a replica of somebody else, but to become yourself.
Self.
But
Yep.
still, that was an idea, a seed that was planted in me as a very, very young girl. And I am eternally grateful for that.
Hmm. In 1967, you described in very colorful terms. You said, and I quote, "I previously encountered some rather sleepy and unaware young people." What do you mean by that?
Oh, I'm not sure that I can pinpoint exactly what led to that comment, but I will say this much to you. Many of us, at points in our lives, have been those slippery and unaware people.
Hmm.
As Black people in this country called the United States of America, when I was growing up, we really didn't have a concept of our history as African people or anything that we could embrace or celebrate as an African descendant people. We were quite unaware. We bought wholesale, many of us, to this, American idealism and American exceptionalism. And we just thought, if we worked hard enough, and if we,
The bootstrap question.
shared, our humanity enough
Mm,
with white people, that they will come to understand and accept us. This
mm.
whole idea of equal rights. And my question is, equal to what? Equal to white people? Who made them the standard? And why should that be what I perceive? So when we talk about slippery and unaware youth, don't you think you were once there? But what did you make of my comments?
Okay, so my understanding of it was prior to that moment, 1967,
Mm-hmm.
one haven't gone through segregation, Jim Crow. The idea is you stay in your lane. You
Mm,
don't ask questions beyond what is in front of you.
mm,
But you would say you encountered people who woke up something that was in you, but you were not that aware that it was
oh yes.
inbred.
Oh yes. Oh
And
yes.
and the
Yes.
words you used was I think they put it to you that black people, especially black poets, should write as blacks about blacks and address themselves as blacks.
I make that face only because this is such a tiresome topic.
Mm,
Even though I cannot escape, um, would I say
blackness.
the importance of still exploring it, and giving people a chance to have that conversation and to think through it. Um, th- as I reflect on it, from when I made that statement to things that have happened later in life,
Mm,
there were also young people who brought to my awareness a different level of consciousness of who we are to be, who we are as Black people, as African people. Um, it's one of the reasons I don't like the term African American. But having said that, or should I say, and having said that, it's interesting, the cycles. And I say the cycles because some of the very people who helped to, during the Black Arts movement,
mm,
engender this sense of we're Black and we're proud, and we don't stay in any boxes that have been created for us, but we fully represent our humanity, and we embrace Blackness as beauty, as power, as strength, as intellect, as everything that we are. Which, by the way, when you read my biography, you, you might not be able to tell over this platform, but I'm a very dark skinned woman. I'm a very dark skinned Black woman. And as a child, today it would be considered bullying. I suppose back then it would have been as well.
mhm,
I was repeatedly told by my own that because I was not bright and light, I was basically to be discarded, to not be seen. The boys would pretty much just look through and past you. You were to be nothing. You could maybe elevate your status if you wore nice clothes. And if you could get a hot comb and straighten your hair and make it really bone straight. And I had an aunt who sewed beautifully. She was the head sewing teacher for her school, and she would send me clothes, sometimes five at a time. So I was always very well dressed. But imagine that the same students who ran after the bright and wealthier Black students would deride me for being a darker skinned Black girl,
Mm.
who dared to dress well. There's so many layers to what we go through. But
Unknown caller.
the point I was trying to make before I came to this point is it's amazing how some of the very people who helped to awaken my awareness of who I am as a Black woman, as a Black person first, and we can get more into that. In the early 70s, we're also the same people who were now justifying not operating in the sense of we, but in an individualistic sense. And I'll give you a very clear example. I was with Harper, the publisher,
Yeah.
I think over 30 years. I want to say maybe 36, 33 to 36 years. And as I became more conscious, I was convinced of this fact that we build nothing as individuals, but that it takes the collective. And so if I were to write and if I were to live up to what I was saying and writing, then I must move to a Black publisher. And I want to give just recognition and love to my dear, dear friend Hakimata Buti. And I began to publish with Black publishers only. And at the same time, like I said, some of the people who had initially seemingly embraced this concept of Black unity and us working together
Mm.
were now moving in droves to the white publishers, slippery and unaware. I
Underwear.
wonder, yes, not just youth. Sometimes we still all get sucked, but not all. Sometimes we still get sucked back into this notion of white is right. And we're looking for that validation. And that is something as the older I got, the more I was convicted and the more I actually made sure that all that my actions aligned with what I believed. Yes.
Mm. You mentioned Hakim Mabute there, and you acknowledge the fact that he would often take a couple of you around to what was then known as Washington Park, which you renamed Malcolm X Park in Chicago, and to recite poems. But there was something about the poems you recited. You said, and I quote, we would often go out and recite relevant poetry to the locals. When you say relevant, are you saying you spoke to the people in a way they could understand, or you gave them a sense that poetry is actually a language of the, for want of a better word, the poor?
Well, let's see what your listeners think. I'm going to share a poem. It is a poem that evokes a lot of emotions, and particularly since Mother's Day was just celebrated, at least in this hemisphere. This might be one that I just want to alert your listeners ahead of time. This might be one that might touch some nerves.
Hmm.
And you tell me after I read this poem what you think I meant by um, relevant, reading poems that were relevant to the people. The poem is titled The Mother. Abortions will not let you forget. You remember the children you got that you did not get. The damp small pulps with a little or with no hair. The singers and workers that never handled the air. You will never neglect or beat them or silence or bite with a sweet. You will never wind up the sucking thumb or scuttle up ghosts that come. You will never leave them controlling your luscious sigh. Return for a snack of them with gobbling mother eye. I have heard in the voices of the wind, the voices of my dim killed children. I have contracted, I have eased my dim dears at the breast they could never suck. I have said, sweets, if I sinned, if I seized your luck and your lives from your unfinished reach, if I stole your births and your names, your straight baby tears and your games, your stilted or lovely loves, your tumults, your marriages, aches, and your deaths, if I poisoned the beginnings of your breaths, believe that even in my deliberateness, I was not deliberate, though why should I whine? Whine that the crime was other than mine? Since anyhow, you are dead, or rather, or instead, you were never made. But that too, I am afraid, is faulty. Oh, what shall I say? How is the truth to be said? You were born, you had body, you died. But on a lighter note, maybe, I'll share one called The Kitchenette Building. We are things of dry hours in the involuntary plan. Grade in and gray. Dream makes a giddy sound, not strong, like rent. Feeding a wife, satisfying a man. But could a dream send up through onion fumes its white and violet fights with fried potatoes and yesterday's garbage ripening in the hall? Flutter or sing an aria down these rooms, even if we were willing to let it in, had time to warm it, keep it very clean, anticipate a message, let it begin? We wonder, but not well, not for a minute. Since number five is out of the bathroom now, we think of lukewarm water, hope to get in it. What do you think about the relevancy of my poems as we read them in what we now call Malcolm X Park?
Okay, so the first one for me was silence grief,
Mm,
because only a mother knows the pains of losing. The father would empathize, but only a mother truly knows. So that for me is silence grief. On the other one, it invokes a sense of joy, but with reflection.
and the realities of our daily lives.
Yes, exactly. Because these are things that everyone, regardless of class, education, would experience, not least motherhood.
That's
So
true.
you cannot, I mean, that is where I get the sense when use the word relevant. Also, it means she is in tune with her people. That is you living within your people, understanding that every day you're very observant of what they go through in terms of everyday occurrence. So that way you're somewhat blessed, because what's the worst thing that can happen to an artist is to lose themselves and completely lose their audience.
Well, you
Then you
know,
might as well write for yourself.
yeah, I was born and I lived my whole life on the south side of Chicago. Yes, I got to travel to many
Mm.
other places and other countries. Um, really grateful for my trips to Africa and to Tanzania. I went to Ghana, I also went to Tanzania, and in Tanzania had the great fortune of breaking bread with none other than Ayikwe Ama.
Mm.
Um, but I wanted to circle back. So if you read my biography, it tells you I was born in Topeka, Kansas. There's a reason. My mother's people, my mother's parents lived in Topeka, Kansas. Now, my mother, before she got married, she was actually a school teacher there, and then she moved to Chicago with my father. My father had always wanted to be a doctor. Moved to Chicago and he started school, but his work hours and his school hours were in conflict. And you have to put food on the table and a roof over your head. And with my mother and myself and my brother. My father abandoned his formal studies, but he never stopped reading medical books. And so for many an ailment, an illness in my household, we had a doctor, but we didn't actually have to go to the doctor because my father had so much knowledge, both of what he had gotten from books and also our traditions as Black people. A little balm here and a little salve here and a little steaming here and a little herb there. But I wanted to, because without my parents, there would not be me. And so I wanted to mention my parents' name. My father was David Anderson Brooks. My father worked as a janitor, sometimes
Mm.
making only $25 an entire week with a whole family to take care of. When my parents got married, would you like to know what my father's wedding present was to his bride?
Please tell.
He gave her a bookcase with a set of Harvard classic books.
Mm.
Had to be a writer.
Mm.
And my mother, from a young age, she loved to read to us. And she would have us memorize these interpretations of works, and we would recite them at church, on special occasions. And so, this love for words and Christmas, which was ooh, glorious. I don't practice Christmas now. I don't celebrate Christmas now. But when I was a child, that's what we knew as Black people. White Santa Claus and all. It was an amazing time of celebration. And let me tell you this, Black people need a time to celebrate. We
Mm.
need, you know what we need? We need a Black Liberation Day. We need a day where it's just, I suppose maybe you might call it Juneteenth, except even that the white people want to get in on. But we need a day where we can just break free from the madness that sometimes is our lives in this country, and where we can commune with all of our brothers and sisters across the globe. And it's a worldwide Black Liberation Day where we just celebrate because we need that. We need that break. But let me get back to my story. So, Christmas, and we would always have the Christmas tree. And we were not allowed to open our gifts on Christmas Eve. You had to wait till Christmas Day. And you know what? Alongside the toys and, train sets for my brother and dolls for me and all of that and clothes, there were always books.
Mm.
And at the end of the day, after the family and the guests had eaten to our fill and all of that, I would find a quiet place behind the Christmas tree and I would sit down and I would lose myself in my books. And that is because of my parents and the environment that they created for me. And I say that story not just to tell the share that story, not just to tell my story, but to encourage parents, particularly as I understand your present times. Oh, you have an obligation to shape your children, to determine what their environment is like and how it feeds them. And when you abandon your responsibility to any and everything else, including all these devices that no longer require thoughts, that no
Mm.
longer require the activation of imagination, we are stunting ourselves. We are stunting ourselves.
Mm.
So I started writing by about 6. My mother says at 7, I had this collection. And guess what? By age 13, I was published in the American Childhood Magazine.
Wow.
Now remember, I was born on June 7th, 1917. So let's think back to this time. At 13, we're talking about 1930. We're talking about the depression.
Russian.
We're
Yeah.
talking about abject poverty
They're talking
sweeping
about
through the
World War II.
country, not even just for black families. And yet my parents nurtured this dream. As a matter of fact, sometimes I didn't even have to do all the chores that I typically would have had to because my parents nurtured and gave me that time to write. And yes, I wrote about what I saw and heard in the street. I wrote about what moved me. I still do that.
There is there is enough to be said about how you represented the role of women within the black community. I mean, you've spoken about it in the poem you read, Mothers, but you also celebrated, how can I say it, the coolness of black people with a poem titled We Real Cool.
We real cool. You gonna
If
read
you don't
that?
mind, I can read it.
Oh, please do.
And it goes thus, it goes, we real cool. We left school. We lock late. We strike straight. We sing. We thin Jean. We jazz June. We die soon. And that was Gwendolyn Brooks is We Real Cool.
Do you
So
remember what year that was written or
that was
published?
early 1934, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah,
Well,
it was part of a tome of essays.
let me say this about We Real Cool. And let me say this about the power of poetry. I could have been writing it right now in 2025,
Mm,
couldn't I?
yeah,
Every the
yep, yep,
theme,
yep.
the idea of young men, young black men trying to make sense of who they are
Yeah, yep.
and our swag, our coolness, um, our a tutu. And there are times when it's rooted in confidence, and there are times when it's rooted in
Defense.
defense and other things. But
Mm,
it's still a poem.
mm.
I think that's why it's one of my more famous poems, even though it's pretty simplistic. Um, but people, it resonates with people, and we still see um, a great too many of our young people in a mindset that leads to death too soon in a world that actually doesn't want you to live.
Um, okay. It's often said that, and I'm going to describe it in the third person now. It says Gwendolyn Brooks doesn't just write poems; she wrote the truth. From Annie Allen to
Mm-hmm.
In the Mecca, she gave voice to those who America tried to erase. I suppose I can caveat that with by saying America is still trying to erase them. So, what would you say to that assessment?
I am of my people, and I am. I wish I could give you a straight answer on some of these things, but I have to say this. There's something about the Black experience in the United States of America in particular. And, I'm going to talk about my lived experience, but there
Mhm.
may be people, Black people in other parts of the world who might be able to relate to this or draw some parallels to their existence as well. If I had died in the 1950s, I would have died a Negro.
Mm.
My parents were colored people. Um, by the late 60s and early 70s, some of us were embracing Black. And then eventually, we saw this movement towards Afro American and African American. And there's a confusion that is created in a people when you're not even clear on who you are and what you're called. And it took me a while to clarify that for myself. But once I dialed in on my Africanness, embracing the very thing that, as I pointed out earlier, some misguided Black people, the features and the hue would discard because they were more interested in the proximity to
Limited to
whiteness.
whiteness. Yeah.
Um, it allowed me to get much clearer on how I write, the lens through which I choose to interpret and share my thoughts. I'll give you an example. My husband and I were in Ghana and we saw this young boy running. And oh my God, this young Ghanaian boy. And he just embodied joy. I mean, that was just, we talk about a baby's a bundle of this was just like watching joy in motion. And my husband and I stayed up till 4 a.m. that morning arguing because for him, he would have written about a boy with joy.
Mm.
But for me in my writing, it was important to me to center that this boy was Ghanaian, this boy was African, this boy was a Black boy. And I suppose that some critics might say, are you not allowing this social construct of race to impact and shade everything? And here's the question that I've posed sometimes to even my white friends. I say, listen, if you see me coming from afar, what is the first thing you see? And they'll say, well, I see my friend. I'm like, no, 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 no. I said, if you see me coming from afar, you can't yet tell it's me. What is the first thing your mind records? And that is as a result of the conditioning here in this country, but I would say with technology increasingly around the world. We see the use of bleaching cream and straightened hair and all of that all over the world. Okay. So I said, would you not first say, oh, that's a person? And they go, oh, that's a Black person. Would you not say that? And then maybe as I get closer, it's, oh, it's a Black woman. Maybe based on how I'm dressed. I
Mm.
understand that people now dress differently, but you know, and and then only when I got closer would you be able to recognize and say, oh, that's Gwendolyn Brooks, my friend. And so when you talk about erasure, and when you talk about um, all the ways that they basically have in the past and again are trying, will always have tried to write us out of history and science and humanity, period. I think that, not I think, I know, I believe that I, as a Black woman, as a writer, as an artist, have an obligation, a duty
Mm.
to write us and our humanity, the fullness of it, in all of the ways it shows up beyond class and age and gender and all of that. I have a responsibility to in my work evoke that, to show that, to celebrate that, to um
Maintain that in our consciousness.
Bring that to the light. We must not say so. When I won the Pulitzer Prize, it'll be like, well, she's a writer who happens to be black. I'm a black woman. I'm a black woman. I am an African woman. I am a black person. I like black because wherever you are in the world, as a black person, we are together. We should be one. We should work together. Um, I'm not a writer who happens to be black.
Mm.
I'm I'm a black person and I write.
So, a question from one of our audience is Peggy Parks Miller. And the question is, you once said, or she wants to know what you meant when you said, we are each other's harvest.
Oh, how I wish I could have a conversation with Peggy. Peggy, thank you so much. And thank you for reading my work. Many of us poets, our work languishes in notebooks that sometimes never get published. And even when they get published, sometimes they're never read. We are each other's harvest. Mm. I'm going to invite your listeners, if we can all just pause for about 30 seconds and just say those words in your mind and tell me where you feel it in your body. We are each other's harvest.
Hmm.
And I would welcome you to put your response, if you can, where others maybe might see it, because it'll be interesting to see what the responses are. I love to teach writing. I love to engage with our people. And so, yes, talking with you is great, but would really be wonderful to get the ideas and thoughts of everybody else who might be watching and be part of this. Um, we are each other's harvest. I am the harvest of my parents and my great grandparents and my great grandparents. They are my harvest as I pull on their stories and their lives and their legacy and the things that they left behind in so many different ways for me. As a collective, we've always won or lost as a collective. We are each other's harvest. When I said pause and say those words, I'll tell you where I felt them today and where I felt them then when I first wrote that. Felt it right here in my heart area. It makes me want to gather us up together. What do you do to get a harvest?
You got that.
You do the work. You sacrifice. You protect, you stake, you trim, you prune, you fertilize, you water, you move plants around to where they can get what they need. You do all of that for the harvest. And so, if we understand that we are each other's harvest, that we lose or win together, we live or die together, then it's also a call to nurture,
Mm.
so that we can have a harvest and that I can harvest on my own. We, the collective, we are each other. This is going to take collective work, not I'm a special Negro and the first and the only and the last. And that's one of the reasons why, oh my goodness, throughout my career, like I said, I lived my entire life on the south side of Chicago. I made money and I put that money back into my community, just like someone held writing workshops that I attended when I was a little girl. I love to go into the schools. I love to engage with the young people. I created a writing award for young people to encourage them. And I share this not to say, look at me and all that I've done. I'm sure if you read anything about me, you know that I am not the attention seeking type, if you will. I don't shy away
Yeah.
from it, but I'm not running after the spotlight. But I share that story to encourage us all to look and see what we are doing
Hmm.
to ensure a harvest in one another, and particularly our young people. If the arts are under assault in the schools, if our history is not being taught, if they're banning our books. I just read about a man in Ohio who went to a library, and I'm not sure how you're allowed to check out 100 books at the same time, but he checked out 100 books on Jewish history, African American history, and LGBTQIA studies, and he burnt them all. So, if we are each other's harvest, what are the things that right now, as you're listening to my voice, being sparked in you, things that you can do, reading circles, personal libraries that are not public libraries that we can build up, pop-up libraries. I mean, you may be able to put one of those little things on your own property where anyone going by those lending tree, they can pick up a book or they can put back a book. How, or maybe it's music.
Mm.
You know, my mother was a fantastic piano player, she's a pianist. And so I want you to, as you learn more about me, which I hope encourages you to go read my poems, because there's something beautiful about sitting with poetry
Hmm.
and hearing the rhythm, the cadence of the words, and picturing in your mind's eye what the writer has written with words. The question is, what are you going to do? And I tell you, I know you didn't ask me this question, but I have to say this because as you go and read my work, as you read Lawrence Dunbar's work, Paul Lawrence Dunbar, I want to, you may have never heard of this man. His name is, and I always kind of get it wrong, P. Patek. And he has, so people always would ask me, who's your favorite poet? And they'd compared me to Walt Whitman and all these other people, and it was Okot P. Patek.
Hmm.
You should go and get his poetry and
Hmm.
sit with his poetry. Let me tell you, some of you might need to revive your romantic lives. There's nothing as quite so beautiful as right before you lay your head down, reading a beautiful piece of poetry. And so I encourage you to to invest in some poetry books, and maybe try your hand at it as well.
Yes. Speaking of poetry, um, initially you said, in the beginning, you said you don't really have fancy for the white gaze and that you always prioritize community recognition over institutional acceptance. And so you gave us this quote. You said, I am not a scholar. I am just a writer who loves to write and will always write. So the question would be, so what does it mean to be honored by a system you critique? With the Pulitzer Prize, obviously. That's what I meant.
Well, like I said, I was in every sense of the word minding my business in a home with no electricity, clearly living a very humble life.
Mm,
when I was made aware that I had been awarded the Pulitzer Prize. And to that extent, I would say we are people of excellence. While I do not need or look to the validation of whiteness to know that I'm good, um, I don't begrudge anyone of any hue, race, background acknowledging that I'm good.
mm,
And mm, and I want to say this for the young people who are listening, that it wasn't an overnight success and it wasn't about chasing success either.
mhm,
It was about discipline and it was about being true to my passion. I wrote because I was compelled to write. Everything else that happened came out of the commitment and dedication I had towards my writing. And so um I've clearly done the work and put out, work that was worthy of the recognition. And so, yes, of course, it should be recognized. The issue for me is not chasing after it or not feeling that that is what defines you or what differentiates whether your work is worthy or not, whether your work is um, of a certain quality or not, whether or not I ever got a Pulitzer Prize. And I won many other kinds of prizes. Um, it's that dedication, that commitment, and understanding um that with this gift that I had, this gift that I was also honing on a daily basis, um yes, I welcomed opportunities to share that with more people in the world. Because at the time when I first started writing, in terms of Black writers or poets, certainly, of course, Paul Laurence Dunbar, you had others who came before me, but many of us in our Black communities were unaware. We,
mm.
we probably, and not probably, I know we had many amazing poets who just wrote in, you know, left it under their mattress or their bed or whatever, and eventually over time it just disappeared with the wind. Um, and so, if my earning a Pulitzer, if any of the accolades I have been afforded allow other people, other young people, other Black people to recognize I can do this too, and it inspires them, yes, let the awards come.
Okay. I mean, it was important that I pose that question because what's the word they often use now? When you do get the prize, yes, you're considered a sellout. So I just wanted to let you have your say with regards to the
That is
fact
that
that you
that that is not a label that will stick to me. Like I said, I
mm,
actually left my white publishers after I got the Pulitzer Prize. Um, at a time when other people were running in the opposite direction. So,
okay.
not at all.
Okay. So one final question. Wasn't it's not a question, it's a statement you made, but I just want you to sort of give life to it. And the statement goes, resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in verse. It walks
Mhm.
through Bronzeville and it listens before it speaks. I can repeat it.
Yeah.
Resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in verse. It walks through Bronzeville and it listens before it speaks.
People would often ask me where I get my inspiration, and I'll say with my people. You know,
Mm,
um, I used to love to take public transportation because you get to see the people at a whole different level than if you're just in a personal car or a jet plane or something of that nature. But I love to observe my people and I live amongst my people. Um, what I would say, I'm going to read something that I wrote. My aim in my next future is to write poems that will somehow successfully call all Black people in taverns, Black people in alleys, Black people in gutters, schools, offices, factories, prisons, the consulate. I wish to reach Black people in pulpits, Black people in mines, on farms, on thrones, not always to teach. I shall wish often to entertain, to illumine. My newish voice will not be an imitation of the contemporary young Black voice, which I so admire, but an extending adaptation.
Hmm.
That
Wow.
is that those words speak to those weren't actually my words, but those words capture what I was about.
Hmm.
Recognizing that we need the we, recognizing that we don't get to our full potential if we don't take care of us, recognizing that nobody else is coming to save us. We must do that work for ourselves, and figuring out how to use my voice, my pen, um, to get to get that point across to as many of us as possible so that we might do the work that is required of us at this time. When I passed away, I was 83 years old. It was December 3rd, 2000. My daughter did an incredible thing for me. My daughter, Nora Blakely. Oh, and did I not mention my husband? I'm going to come back to that. I have to mention my husband. But Nora and some other family and friends they read poetry to me in my dying hours. And right before I took my last breath, she put a pen in my hand. I died with a pen in my hands. But
Hmm.
I also want to say this for people who have dreams and goals and want to make something of their lives. Who you partner with is really important. My husband said to me, I will never prioritize housework over your writing. And so in my marriage, even though we did have a little separation for about 2 years, we separated.
Yep.
Um, but my husband respected my work, honored my gift and my discipline. And in our marriage, in our family, did not make me have to feel guilty about choosing to do my work. Perhaps because he too was a writer. Um, but I'm eternally grateful that I did not have to within my home have that struggle with him. So I had parents who encouraged my writing, and I had a husband who encouraged my writing. That was a beautiful gift.
Hmm. Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing your parts, your life with us. And I must say to our audience, if you do appreciate this, like, share, subscribe. And next week, we'll be looking at another writer, but this one with a completely different upbringing, life. Mm. Her name is Bessie Heard. Again, I repeat, Bessie Heard. So until next week, when we come to you with another episode of Women and Resistance, thank you, Miss Gwendolyn Brooks. Any final words?
Poetry is life distilled. Poetry is resistance. Art is protest.
Hmm.
Lean in.
There's nothing more to add other than to say good night and see you next week. See you next week, people. Good night and God bless.